My name is James Linden, and this is the IMN Debates, and we are debating COVID-19. And today we have Ivor Cummins with us, and Ivor is going to put across a little bit of the other side of the story from the story that we heard yesterday with Professor Ger Colleen and Professor Sam McConkey. And so, Ivor, firstly, welcome to the debate. Thank you very much for giving us your time. Maybe you might tell some of the audience a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you've been up to the last while. That's made us want to have you on the show.
Yeah, no, thanks, James. No problem. Great to be here. Very briefly, 30 years ago did biochemical engineering. I've spent around 25 years in corporate technical leadership positions, people management, but mainly leading large worldwide complex problems, multi-interaction problems. So every aspects of the physics and chemistry included statistics and problem-solving tools. So that's what I've done all my life, basically. And around 7 or 8 years ago, I got poor blood tests, and I went to a series of doctors to get answers, didn't really get them. So someone like me, my background, I went and researched. And in a few weeks, I discovered what the problem was. It was excessive carbohydrate in my diet. And I lost, around 2 stone and blood pressure down and incredible results. So I spent the last 7 or 8 years lecturing on preventing heart disease, diabetes type 2, modern chronic disease, and I've researched around 3,000 published papers on that topic and integrated all of the best things to do for long-term health. And then this year, Corona came along, and within a few weeks, I realized that the initial panic reaction, was to do lockdowns. Now, I knew they would be very ineffective because it didn't take much research to know that. But I thought they're scared. And then I said, in April, May, this thing's going to turn like any bad influenza, like seasonal illness, because coronaviruses are sharply seasonal. Yeah. So I said, then they're going to have to back off all of this. And then there's nothing till next winter where we get a resurgence, but it'll never be as bad as the initial novel virus coming out. Yeah. And then, we know what happened after that. So I stayed involved, and I've 7 days a week on the research, interviewed professors all over the world and doctors on this. And here I am.
Yeah, okay. And essentially, Ivor, your suggestion is that, and I think it's quite commonly held by many, including many top professors in the world's leading medical schools like Oxford, that the pandemic and any scare or any reason we have to be scared has passed us, and we're now living in a world where we're testing for the history of disease.
Essentially. Yeah. So, past us is kind of a risky phrase, because once a virus comes in and becomes endemic, it's going to be here forever. Not forever, actually. Sometimes when a new influenza comes in, the one that's been there for 40 years disappears, never to be seen again, because virome is complex. And interestingly, with SARS-CoV-2, this one, it's kind of kicked influenzas out of the bed. So you might have noticed that influenzas have gone right down because the virome interacts. Viruses interact to each other. It's past us largely. So in Northern Europe, our seasonal pattern is we've got what we saw, a huge rise and a fall off. And the reason the curve falls off is not really lockdowns. It's the passing of the susceptible people, community immunity develops, and you have the seasonal change where the virus becomes suppressed due to human immunity rising, etc. So we see the curve like we expected. It fell like we expected. Yep. And then what happens is when you come into the new winter season, the virus rises. And we know this from coronaviruses. It's well studied. And many studies show this pattern. And what happens in the winter is a resurgence. It's not a second wave. That's an absurdity. That refers back to 1918 flu, which was a once-in-a-century occurrence. And the second wave is actually highly likely a different virus or pathogen. So that's ridiculous. But you get a winter resurgence. So what we predicted months ago is exactly happening. And I liken it for people to think of skipping a stone on the water. Your first skip of the stone is big. That's the epidemic with a new virus. The second can be chunky. That's the second bounce. but after that you get da. And that's after this winter, SARS-CoV-2 is just truly endemic in Europe. And, you know, that's kind of its move. It's not going to do a whole lot.
And so you mentioned a couple of things there around, you know, SARS-CoV-2 taking the place of the flu this year. I'm very curious about all of that, I guess. My biggest curiosity is around the actual classification of COVID-19 as a disease versus I actually had cancer and I died of cancer. So I wonder, you know, if we can't get the testing for COVID right and the normal influenza that we talk about changes every year, then what are the tests to say where it is or isn't, and what are people actually dying from? It's probably, that wasn't really a question, Ivor, but if maybe you want to add some commentary around that.
Right. Well, yeah, the testing is a massive problem because the PCR test is not intended to be diagnostic. And we've got legal cases now have popped up in Portugal where they've won, and in Italy there's one, and in Germany, and that's correct and appropriate. So PCR testing should not be used in the way it's being used. Now, during an epidemic, you get a lot of people who are infected, and the PCR test gives you a fair idea of what's going on. So it's kind of useful. Yeah. But after you've been through an epidemic and you get the winter resurgence and it's kind of endemic, and there's some dormancy as well. So a lot of these cases may be the rise of a virus from a dormant state. So it's not even really like, you know, transferred from person to person when one person gets it. Not necessarily. But the test, it looks for fragments of protein that are associated with the virus. So if you do 10,000 people, let's say, and you get 100 positives, what our leaders are saying is we got 100 cases. But all during the summer, many of those would have been false positives because the test is a certain rate of just false positives. Many more would be just dead viral fragments from an old infection that are meaningless. And many more would be virus infections that are so low and fading that the person's not transmissible. So if you add together all of those out of the 100, they could make up most of the 100 positive cases. Yeah. But only the handful left are transmissible or symptomatic or useful, relevant cases. So hopefully people realize the PCR test is utterly inappropriate for driving policy in an endemic resurging winter virus. What you need to use is ICU loading, and not just ICU loading numbers or hospitalizations directly driven from COVID. You need to use those figures versus prior flu seasons. So only if you are seeing ICU disproportionately in a fairly big way, or hospitalizations driven directly by COVID, not the current hospitalizations. If you fall off your bicycle and you break your leg and you go in and you get a positive swab, that's going into the COVID hospitalizations numbers. I know it's stunning, but it's true. But if you get the true hospitalizations, symptomatic, you know, with respiratory challenges relating, and ICU, and those figures are much higher than a prior season like 2018, then you can begin to consider more severe measures than for any normal influenza season. And we haven't seen that in Ireland. So unfortunately, they're using cases, and they're not cases, they're positive PCR, right? They're using those to drive modeling, which is terribly badly over counting, to drive policy. So what we have at the moment in an engineering world, they'd be fired, that literally.
So I used to do a lot of PCR over years ago, and one of my projects was we were looking at trying to identify strange fungal pathogens in patients that were immunocompromised. So we designed primers for PCR to detect the smallest amounts of fungus that you could possibly imagine. But what you get is cross-reactivity with other species and similar genomes. And I ended up finding traces of this kind of some Chinese medicines that, you know, I'd never heard of, but thought, okay, they're probably there because those patients ate those things to try to, save themselves. But in this current situation, they would be going down as they didn't die of cancer, they died of orange peel poisoning.
Yeah.
To draw the comparison. And all we were doing was, and we spent a lot of time making primers. Everyone at the minute's making primers in a rush to get paid, to keep their company moving, to get some scam grant off whatever country is going to pay them some scam grant to make their bullshit device. Sorry. And that's what's happening a lot. It's very frustrating. And PCR, like this talk of the cycles, we used to do kind of 20 to 30 cycles maybe, but they're cycling up to 45 times. I mean, if somebody else was in the room near that, whose uncle used to have COVID a million years ago, there's a chance that might come up positive.
A COVID fart even could set off in the next room, positive. It's quite insane. And I wonder, they must understand some of this, because a freedom of information recently, the Irish government had to admit they're using 40 to 45, which is ridiculous. And they also have a report out from the health authority quietly on the 8th of October, warning what we're saying, that the cycles are very likely way too high and maybe getting a lot of problematic, not relevant positives. That came out quietly from the Irish health authorities. So there's knowledge there of what we're saying, and yet NPHET are now using PR companies, I think it came up in the newspaper the other day, to bypass the government and to terrorize the nation more directly than through the politicians, which is actually quite extraordinary. It's bizarre and unsettling, and they're using cases. So I think in the coming weeks, you're going to see a lot more about this from Irish groups who will be coming at them about these ridiculous case numbers being used to destroy society and cause massive collateral suffering and death. I think they'll be taken on this.
Yeah, one of the questions that I kept raising on LinkedIn before I quit, because it's a poisonous cesspit for me anyway, and my negativity at times. But I was just like, you've got all of these different bodies just ignoring fact, and yet we're turned around to these NPHET characters, and I don't know who any of them are. I know some of them kind of, because I looked in to find out who they are, but these are not like the smartest people we have in the country. They're not the top performing virologists or any of that. They are, unfortunately, not that. I'll leave it there. But so why are we listening to them? Who are they? Where did they come from? Who gave this guy, Philip Nolan, the keys of the fucking car and said, right, you go and drive that car into the wall, mate?
Well, yeah, he's driving it into the wall repeatedly, though. And then turning around, reversing it into the wall to make sure he smashes the back of it as well. It's crazy. On Nolan's team, right? Nolan, on his team, apparently, there's an Imperial modeler from Imperial College, a lady. And, that's a disaster.
We already know
Once
that.
you've got one of those guys, you are finished. So Neil and the team, we know now they were out by a factor of 12 in their estimation, and they're still on the media. And their curves for Whitty and Valence recently showing that this winter to go up like this, it's a complete farce. The results are the opposite. And they've got one of their people seeded into the Irish modeling group. So they're coming out with nonsense, right? And it's patently clear. And then you got Holohan, right? And we know about the cervical smear disgrace, women's deaths.
Yeah.
And he single-handedly was involved in hiding the data. So that's the quality of character there, right? And again, it's not me judging, it's the reality judging. And now he's been given full control. But I don't see him focusing at all on population health.
It's scarier, Ivor. It's even scarier than that, because that man who's in control has a very ill wife, as we all know, because it's in the paper. His wife is, he cannot be in a good stress place to be dealing with one of the hardest jobs in the country right now. And again, I've kind of called publicly before for his resignation, but I just think that he should not be leading our health services. No one that we've been presented with so far. Well, I've got one or two who I have a little faith in within government, who are of a medical ilk. But the rest at the minute are making up shambles of this, it just doesn't make any sense medically, scientifically, politically.
Yeah.
You know,
I would say
it makes sense.
I'd say they're a nexus of bad science that's been handed the reins of the country. And I'd be agreed with by a lot of heavy hitting people in science. And it's just unbelievable what they've been let do. But you got to remember that underneath this cabal are the politicians, and they don't have a technical bone in their body. I mean, people who go into politics, they've got different strengths, shall we say, to be nice. And journalists and media have different strengths than technical. Let's call it the other side of the brain is where they excel. So you've got all of these people who are technically inept being led by a bunch of ex-civil servants and non-practicing doctors and characters like we just mentioned, who seem to be on a mindless mission to destroy our society. And they don't seem to realize either. There's over 20 published papers now and analyses, including in the Lancet, that clearly show that lockdown measures do not really change the mortality per million. And that's the only thing you could ever lock down for.
Yeah.
You know, if you've got a problem with hospital capacity, which we dramatically don't in Ireland, we know that. And we never even had during the actual epidemic. But if you had a problem, all summer when you're telling us and terrorizing the people about a second wave is coming, remember that? Why didn't you put in some extra capacity? But they didn't do any of that. They literally sat on their hands, masked everyone in the middle of the summer for a seasonal virus where it was patently obvious that nothing was going to happen until September, October. But they put masks on our children and everyone and did nothing to increase capacity for their claimed second wave. And now what have we got? A winter resurgence, exactly as we expected.
So do you think that this is stupidity that's caused this?
There are limits. George Carlin once said, the comedian in America, he said, the average person, think of how stupid they are, and 50% of them are more stupid than that. I think it is sometimes, because I don't think they can be that stupid. So I think they're either been influenced by WHO and worldwide bodies who seem to have a compelling interest in taking advantage of this mess, or they're caught up now in their own cognitive dissonance. Like, they're so caught up in this, enthusing amongst each other, that they actually believe their own bullshit now.
I like the Mark Twain one that says it's easier to fool someone than to convince them that they have been fooled.
Yeah. And, you know, I'll tell you another thing that's absolutely stunning to me. I have many doctors who are friends in Ireland and vast quantities around the world. But the doctors in Ireland tell me, and recently one of them in England said the same, that most doctors actually buy this, even though it's patently fraudulent and false or stupid. Most doctors apparently have fallen. And I have one friend who's a doctor who's convinced a few otherwise with the data. And it's taken them around 30 minutes going through it, like talking to a child. And then they slowly dawns on them and they go, I never thought of it like that before. So you're talking about people now who are literally in a kind of psychotic state, the public and even doctors, a kind of a mass delusion. The virus is real. The impact was substantial. It was like a severe flu, seasonal. These things are all true. But look where the people are, and even the doctors. They think there's some kind of Black Death, and we know there's not. I mean, if you open your eyes, it's so obvious.
Yeah, well, I think there was, a terrible amount of media influence going on, even in up north. I was hearing of hospital capacity being at full tilt, but then actually talking to people that work there and finding out, but sure, we've got another 40 beds. We just haven't commissioned those yet, so they're not in the official numbers of free beds. Oh yeah, thanks, you scary wankers.
Well, the modeling, you know what? If you take out the PCR nonsense, right, which we know you must get rid of, and you take out the modeling nonsense, which is built on the PCR nonsense, now you've collapsed a pile of nonsense. And what you're left with is reality. Look around you. We have a similar ICU loading to prior seasons. The winter resurgence is behaving exactly like all viruses in history. That is clear as day. So when you actually take away the nonsense, you can't scare people anymore. Oh, we got 30 people in ICU and it's gone up to 34. 5 million people in Ireland. Oh, so let's say you got 40. We have 8 people per million people in Ireland in an ICU bed. And half of them are not driven by COVID, maybe more than half. You got a couple of people per million people in the country suffering from the thing you're talking about. That doesn't even compete with car crashes. So do you know what I mean? When you take away the PCR and you take away the modeling, which I think it's fraudulent and corrupt as well as stupid. But again, that's a personal opinion. When you take that away, people could actually realize nothing's happening. And you know what? During the actual epidemic, sad though it was, the average age of passing was around the life expectancy. 95% of the people who did pass were never given ICU because they were too old or sick, independent of COVID.
Dad, Ivor, was, Dad, if you live to the average age of COVID, you'll do better than the average man in Ireland at 81. Yeah. So like, let's hope you get COVID, you know, sick joke, but he'd get an extra year out of that based on the average.
Yeah, I've heard that one, yeah, and it's that absurd. And, 95% never got ICU, which tells you everything. So if you take away, in fairness, you must take those away to look at the real impact of the epidemic outside people who are so sick or aged that they were near the door anyway. Yeah. You're left with less than 1 person per million people in Ireland and died at the peak of the epidemic. And after that, it's been basically flatline ever since. Deaths per million in Ireland who are not aged or very ill already, they're just tiny. I mean, I don't even know the number. It's just forget it.
But Ivor, there's people that like John Prine who died from COVID, who the singer, a lot of people will know. But John Prine had lung cancer, had a lung removed, had cancer for the last 17 years, and it's front headlines of the Telegraph or whatever. Prine dies of cancer or of COVID. No, he doesn't. He died.
That's fraud. That's fraud, because that's not stupidity. That's fraud. And another poor young man with Cushing's syndrome. So they have extremely high cortisol and they get heart failure, it destroys the organs. And that was known. And he hit all the headlines in Ireland. Youngest victim of COVID or whatever, 17. And his parents came out angry a day later and said he died of heart failure. He got a positive swab, I think 4 or 5 weeks before, and he had a negative one in the week before his death. He died of heart failure, and we don't want him used to sell this boat. So that's what's happening. Now, that's fraud, right? That's propaganda, and it's fraud. And they're doing it. So then you can say, well, why? And the media in Ireland have disgraced themselves. Almost beyond redemption. I call RTE Pravda Ireland because they are unbelievable. News Talk, not quite as bad.
Not even very good at their jobs when you read their articles. Their health correspondents, their arse from their elbow. You know, I would love to do a little show on them all one day.
Maybe, yeah.
But the table, but like, come on, guys, make an effort. If you're RTE, make an effort. You're about to have your funding pulled, I see, by Micheál Martin, which would be fucking hilarious. I don't know if you saw that article today or not yet, but apparently Micheál is considering pulling funding for them. So I know they must be having a fight.
Yeah, poor old Micheál. I mean, I've been informed from the inside that poor Micheál, of course, he can't understand technically this scenario. So he's literally just dancing like a marionette, on the strings of NPHET. So it all goes back to NPHET. And if you want to go back from NPHET to what's driving this madness, well, then you're up to the WHO. And I mean, I just keep telling people, the WHO October guidelines, 2019, no isolation of exposed individuals once a virus has entered a society in a pandemic. There's no point. They didn't even cover locking down the whole country because that'd be too stupid to consider. So what the WHO decided to do was copy China in February. Now, how do you throw out a century of pandemic science that culminated in your guidelines October 2019 with the best wisdom and science of 100 years, and you flush it down the toilet and copy China. I mean, people don't realize how anti-scientific lockdown is. They think intuitively this will help. It's a fantasy. We have 20 studies showing lockdown does not change mortality per million. And we have 2 studies showing that lockdown, if you do flatten the curve a little, it will cause higher total COVID-19 death when you include the next season because of community immunity suppression. Granny will be killed more likely because of your lockdown.
Yeah.
And no one knows this because you're right. The media is parroting nonsense. And these guys that maybe you've interviewed, I mean, there's a handful of them. I think there's Killeen, he's some infectious disease, something or other. The numbers he came out with were out by a factor of 15. McConkie is peddling fear around the clock. Luke O'Neill is just, I don't know, he's just a comedy star. So I don't know what to say about him.
Put Park Granda by the window. Look, what are you talking about? That's mental.
I mean, you can put a link to a video I released yesterday. It's got 110,000 views already on Twitter and YouTube. And it's a video of him on a Zoom call to a school of kids. And he's telling them they'll have to wear bracelets, non-removable bracelets, to show they're vaccinated. And he's giggling at them and saying, oh, if you want to go to your Debs, I'm sure you'll take the vaccine. I mean, you couldn't make it up. And then you got Tomas Ryan. Now, Tomas is interesting because I don't know what's going on inside his head, but I've watched him. There's something broken in there. There has to be. There has to be something broken.
We should explore him in another episode where we expose all these NPHET people.
You should explore him in a psychiatry laboratory, I think. But again, that's my opinion.
Okay, very good. Ivor, is there anything? I think we're getting near closing time. Thank you for your time. Is there anything that you wanted to add, or any, like, I mean, what I'm trying to do for everybody is just present both sides of this ridiculous story, and everybody is ridiculous in it, including me and you and all of the other speakers, but to allow everyone else to make up their own minds and to be simple and fair. So is there anything you'd like to add before you leave or anything?
Yeah, well, some of the facts I dropped there, and I know we had some banter, but we also got in some important numeric facts, which are real and true and completely eviscerate the other side because they're facts. But I just throw a couple more. And Ireland in the first 6 months of this year, including the epidemic, has no excess all-cause mortality versus prior years. And April is no worse than January of 17 and 18. And that's a fact. And the lockdown didn't help it be like that. Like, it could have been worse because we have 20 papers showing lockdown doesn't affect mortality, whatever about hospital loading, right? So that's a fact as well. People need to know these facts. I'll tell you one last fact. There's really only one country in Europe that actually followed the time-honored WHO guidelines of 2019. And they did perfectly well, as good as any country. Who is that country?
I think it's Sweden, Ivor, is it?
It is, absolutely. So when people hear Sweden did something unusual, you're all wrong, guys.
Yeah.
All of us did something bizarre and unusual and unscientific, right? And it didn't make any difference, really. Sweden were the only ones who followed the science.
Yeah.
That's it. And history will record that.
And Sweden finished pretty much neck and neck with Ireland in the big weird game of COVID Eurovision death contest.
Yeah.
Pretty much, right? And
I have photos September, October from Sweden. They're all living almost normally, just following general hygiene. Stay at home if you're sick. Shops full, restaurants fine. No masks anywhere, even on public transport. I have all the photos. And now they're one of the best performers in Europe, as expected. And their death rate is curling over, and their cases in a relatively small seasonal resurgence, exactly as we said months ago. So here's the situation where all the top experts are wrong on almost every facet of this complex multi-factor problem. So you got to ask yourself, how are all the experts wrong on nearly every facet? And how were we able to say how it was going to be back in April practically? And have been correct on everything ever since, including seasonality, infection fatality rate, seasonal resurgence, including its probable size, yada, yada, yada. So myself, professors, doctors, immunology, epidemiology, right, all over the world, the group of so-called, niche views have been correct all the way. And the so-called experts, and it is written, it is demonstrated, have been incorrect all the way. It's not like there's kind of two sides to this. It's only one side. And that side is science.
Thank you, Ivor. Here's the science.
Here's the science. Spent my whole life supporting it, and I wasn't going to stop in March 2020.
And boo to scientism, which is what people think science is these days. Boo.
Scientism.
Thanks, Ivor.
Madness.
Take care.
Thank you, James. Bye now.